Professor Sachs, thank you so much for joining us here on NDTV.
It's my pleasure.
Professor Sachs, President Trump's key reason for his trade policy is that the world has taken advantage of the United States. He points to various trade deficits, for example, with India, and he thinks it's high time for a level playing field. But you've likened the approach to Mickey Mouse country. Why do you say that?
Well, I said that the interpretation of trade deficits is a bit Mickey Mouse, meaning that it is dramatically wrong and oversimplified to the point of being ridiculous. Trade deficits occur when countries in the aggregate spend more than they produce. This is an identity, we say in economics. In other words, it's a precise definition of what we mean by a comprehensive trade deficit, which we measure as a country's current account deficit. The fact of the matter is the United States spends more than it produces. And the main reason for that is our chronic large budget deficit. In fact, our government acts as a kind of credit card for the nation. The government borrows at relatively low cost, or it used to borrow at relatively low cost, and then it would make transfers of income back to the population through various programs. And it's been doing that for more than 2 decades, and the debt has accumulated dramatically of the government. And the counterpart of that is massive spending on foreign goods. So we've had current account deficits alongside budget deficits. If President Trump is serious about wanting to reduce the external deficit, he needs to cut the internal deficit. Or to put it another way, if he wants to get these trade deficits down, he has to get the budget deficit down. But he seems intent on not doing that. He wants more tax cuts for his favored recipients, larger military spending, continued large deficits. So we'll have continued large trade deficits as well.
But there's this whole sentiment of likening the deficit to countries stealing from the United States. It's wrong and needs to stop. What do you have to say to that?
I think it's not true. And interestingly, when the idea of reciprocal tariffs was first announced, the idea of the reciprocity was to be that the U.S. would calculate what other countries or governments are doing to U.S. goods, and the U.S. would do the same vis-a-vis those countries. That's what the term reciprocal was supposed to mean in reciprocal tariffs. When these reciprocal tariffs were actually announced, they had nothing whatsoever to do with reciprocity. In fact, the U.S. government said, well, we can't really calculate what the other countries are doing, so we will use the bilateral trade deficit as a measure of the supposed unfairness. But as I've explained, that's ridiculous. If you take your credit card and you go shopping on a shopping spree and you buy goods from various stores, the amount that you purchase from those stores is not a measure of how unfair those stores are to you. Those stores are selling things that you want to buy. So in the end, there was nothing reciprocal about these reciprocal tariffs. And in this sense, there's nothing in the Trump policy that's really about leveling the playing field or about making other countries more fair. The whole thing is it's Mickey Mouse. I'm sorry to say, it's just doesn't add up to anything that a responsible government would be doing. Now, these tariffs have also been blocked by the U.S. Court of International Trade, our specialized court that oversees trade policy. And this is not a surprise to me. I said from the first moment that these tariffs were not only a mistake, not only wrongly justified, not only not likely to have effects, but also, I said from the beginning, illegal. In other words, an exercise of power that was not consistent with the rule of law. The courts see eye to eye with that interpretation as well. So there's a good chance that these tariffs will never be imposed, whether the White House wants it or not, because the courts will block it. Of course, we're in the middle of that legal process right now.
Professor Sachs, one of many countries trying to strike a trade deal with the US is India. Some news reports suggest that New Delhi has toughened its stance as it works to strike a deal more favorable to India. Now, you've said do not allow Trump to play India. How much leverage do you think India has at this juncture, given that the US is its largest trading partner?
Well, the first point I would say about the U.S. economy is that it is large, but not a dominant or overwhelming part of the world economy, and a large but not dominant part of the U.S. The world demand for exports, whether from India or any other country. So I think the tariffs are harmful to India as they are also to other countries and to the United States. So I don't think that they're insignificant, but I would not let a national policy be overwhelmed by them. I think India is trying to assess where things are. If I were in the Indian position, I would be actively pursuing a diversification of markets. India is a large, important, fast-growing economy, one of the world's major economies. It should have markets all over the world. Again, let me stress something not so popular in India, but I insist on it all the time. India and China should have good trade relations. India should definitely be pursuing ASEAN right next door, which is very important in Southeast Asia. India should be expanding its reach in the African Union countries. After all, just like India, the African Union is 1.5 billion people, albeit poor on average, but the African Union economy, now a continental free trade area, will be a very large market for India, and India has a lot to export to Africa, especially around digital technologies. So I think it's extremely important for India not to lose sight of the overall world market and to be at least as active, more active, in fact, in pursuing other markets as it is in trying to find reasonable terms with the United States. I don't think India wants to make an enemy of the United States, by no means. But India does not have to give in to outlandish U.S. unilateral demands, just like no other country should.
Professor Sachs, you expect India to become the second largest economy in the world in about 10 or 15 years. How are we going to get there?
There's a general principle of economies today, which is that economies that are relatively poorer than other economies have the opportunity to grow relatively faster. A very structural situation we call conditional convergence. The reason is simple. India is poorer today because it has less capital per person than the richer countries, and less capital in three senses. First, in human capital, meaning that India's educational attainments on average in the population should be higher. There should be more years of schooling on average. Younger people, of course, are much better educated than their parents' generation and much, much better educated than their grandparents' generation. That extent of educational upgrading should continue rapidly. India needs infrastructure, more in the power sector, more in the transport sector, fast rail, fiber, Of course, other parts of infrastructure, social infrastructure, such as social housing and so forth. There's a lot of investment to be made in India in the next 20 years. Very high return investment. And then, of course, there's the business sector. The business sector cuts across all of the economy: agriculture, mining, construction, industry, services. So there's going to be a boom in many sectors of the Indian economy. So when I say that India will become the second largest economy, first I'm referring to the fact that India will be the number one economy in terms of population in the world. And that population is going to be having rising income per person. And when you take that large population and rapidly rising output or income per person, that means very substantial economic growth. India is on that path right now. It's achieving economic growth of around 6% per year. It could be a bit higher. I think India could grow at 7% per year consistently. That means a doubling of the economy every 10 years. You do that 30 years and you're 8 times larger as an economy. India could even grow faster than that, given the rapid advances in digital technologies in which India is playing a very dynamic part. So all of this is to say, I'm very optimistic about the Indian economy. It will be a world-leading economy integrated with all other parts of the world economy.
Professor Sachs, let's turn back to an economy that has you worried, the United States. Now, the Fed, the central bank, in its latest minutes of their meeting, have warned of an increasing recession risk. The US has seen recessions before. What do you see different this time around as far as the impact on the rest of the world goes?
Well, first, we're having a self-inflicted recession or economic crisis. The economy was not heading for a downturn before all of the uncertainties and instabilities of recent weeks took hold. These are uncertainties that are causing the Fed and private forecasters to revise their estimates. They've also caused a downturn, albeit with ups and downs, in consumer sentiment. There's just a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And that uncertainty is largely self-inflicted. We can't seem to have a rational economic policy that rationally examines where an economy should head, and in particular to digital and green technologies, that is low carbon. The U.S. has abandoned the low carbon road at the federal level of this administration, so we don't even know which direction to go, because Trump has pulled the U.S. once again out of the Paris Climate Agreement and has downplayed structural transformation that's needed. And then comes the tariff disruptions of world trade, and now comes a budget policy that is, I guess, in Elon Musk's words, a monstrosity. And so this is our problem. We're making a mess of things internally. Here you have the richest economy in the world, but it just can't behave in a rational way.
Talking about the US and its ballooning deficit, Trump's mega bill is facing some opposition from Republican senators, not just Elon Musk. The bill is forecast to add $2.4 trillion in debt over the next decade. If you could explain in simple terms why this is such a big problem.
Basically, there is no agreement in the United States about what the government should do and how it should pay for what it does. And the result is that we have a chronic situation where the government at the federal level takes in about 16% of gross domestic product and spends 22 or 23% of gross domestic product. That gap is our deficit. of about 6 to 7% of GDP. And that deficit is financed by selling government debt, U.S. Treasury bills and bonds. That debt is rising sharply. We have a mountain of debt that has accumulated that is now about 100% of our national income. That means that as interest rates rise, the interest bill on this debt is now around 3% of our gross domestic product, and it will continue to rise because interest rates themselves are now rising, certainly at the long-term end, to above 5%, 5 percentage points, I should say, 5% per year yields. So we have a mountain of debt, a rising debt, rising interest rates on that debt, and this stretches out for decades to come on the current policy scenario. Our Congressional Budget Office projects that the debt will rise to above 150% of GDP. Well, what does that mean? It has many implications. One is financial instability. Governments with such large debts are unstable, and that is why Moody's just downgraded the U.S. credit rating by one notch, one step. That means higher borrowing costs, and that can lead to a vicious spiral where the borrowing costs rise. That exacerbates the deficits because you have to pay interest on this mountain of debt, and that leads to a spiral of instability. Of course, many countries have been caught in the past by such a spiral of instability. These debts and this low saving, of course, translate into this large borrowing from abroad. That puts the U.S. in this extraordinary position where it's trying to boss the world around, but it absolutely depends on the world for borrowing. China is one of its major creditors, and yet it wants to have an economic war with China. It's mind-boggling to go to war with your creditor this way. So this is another cost. Of course, there are many drags on the U.S. economy. One of the notable drags is that in the modest steps to do something on the spending side, the U.S. is cutting into the heart of its science and technology policy. It's actually cutting my university, Columbia University, and other major universities off from funding for scientific research. Mind-boggling. Of course, that's cutting your artery of innovation policy, which is the lifeblood, in fact, of rising living standards through improved technology. So there's so many things wrong with having a government that overspends chronically and in which there is not an honest debate and then a resolution. What should we spend on and how should we finance it? We don't have that kind of agreement in the United States.
Let's talk a little bit more about U.S. education. Now, Professor Sachs, you teach at an Ivy League institute, Columbia, as you mentioned. This week saw Trump escalating his attack on Columbia. We've seen the fight with Harvard get uglier and uglier. What do you predict happening with America's elite institutes? Will it really be worthwhile for students from all across the world, including India, to risk studying at these universities given this chaos?
It's chaos. I call it America's cultural revolution. Of course, recalling the absolute instability and self-inflicted harm of China during the 1960s when the major universities were basically closed down. And this administration, again, lawlessly, in my view, without authority, without the rule of law, is on a warpath. Now, when Trump issues such proclamations from on high, most of these are utterly illegal, without due process, without legal authority. And so Harvard runs to the courts and gets a judge to say, no, the administration can't do that. Of course, then a lot of long-term litigation ensues. Columbia, my university, hasn't run to the courts. It's tried to play nice with the administration. You don't get very far with this administration playing nice. It goes back to the trade negotiations also. From Trump's point of view, if you play nice, it means you're weak. It means there's something more you can exploit. And so Colombia keeps facing more and more grossly illegal challenges. The most recent, a decision on high that Colombia does not deserve accreditation. Here's one of the world's leading institutions. It's been open for business since 1754, providing quality education. It's got a spectacular science faculty and wonderful colleagues across many different schools. And then comes the president of the United States and declares this place should not be accredited. You'd laugh it off if it weren't so serious in its short-term implications. For the long term, I'm not worried. For the short term, it's really self-inflicted harm of the United States.
I'd like to talk a little bit about Ukraine. Professor Sachs, you see US President Trump and Russian President Putin as largely sharing a similar position on how to end the war in Ukraine. And you've also suggested very controversially that Ukraine should give up territory seized by Russia. Why do you make that argument?
Well, first of all, Ukraine is losing a vast number of its population. It's a tragedy. It was avoidable, easily avoidable. By the way, what happened in Ukraine needs to be put in its historical context, and that is that the U.S. and extremist right-wing forces in Ukraine overthrew a government in 2014. So the government in power in Ukraine is a kind of regime installed by a regime change operation in which the United States played a major role. These regime change operations of the United States are a core part of U.S. foreign policy that are absolutely destructive and insidious. The U.S. has overthrown dozens and dozens of governments. It almost always ends badly, as is the case in Ukraine. Why did the United States conspire to overthrow the government in Ukraine in February 2014? Because that government of Viktor Yanukovych had the temerity to want neutrality for Ukraine, which is the only sensible policy for a country in Ukraine's geography. That is, Ukraine sits between Western Europe and Russia, and that means that it's really in between a U.S. Military alliance and Russia. And if you're between two giants, please be careful. This was my advice to the Ukrainians all along. But the Ukrainians said, no, the Americans will protect us. I said, oh, God help you. The Americans don't protect you. Remember Henry Kissinger's famous adage that, of course, to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. And what he was referring to is how many times the U.S. sidled up to a country, said, we've got your back. And that country ended up in absolute disaster. So I tried to tell the Ukrainians, don't go for NATO enlargement. Don't antagonize your powerful neighbor to the east. That will be your neighbor no matter whether you like them or not. So learn to get along in your neighborhood. But the siren calls of NATO were so strong in Ukraine, they just dismissed me as a naysayer, and they went the NATO route, and they've ended up in a disastrous war. Now, it's very important to understand on territory, while this is a very unpleasant situation.
Professor Sachs, always great getting your insights. Hope to speak with you in a few months from now. Thank you very much again.
Great to be with you. Thank you so much.